Alright, now let's move on to the one that kind of stands alone in the novella department. I guess you could still call it a collection of novellas, even though they pretty much tell the same sort of gigantic story that kind of goes off into different perspectives and different outcomes of characters that we meet throughout the different stories. But the movie mainly focuses on two, the first one and the last one, which are called Low Men in Yellow Coats and Heavenly Shades of Night Are Falling, which is interesting because there is an individual story in the book called Hearts in Atlantis that the movie does not go into at all. So they just kept the title of the full collection and kind of found their way around that. When actually it's a relatively clever way where they kind of have Ted have this throwaway line where he like compares childhood to the city of Atlantis. So you can probably find something in there if you're not familiar with the book. But the story, Hearts in Atlantis, follows a character named Peter that is in college and gets addicted to the card game Hearts, naturally, and ends up falling for Carol, who is the love interest of Bobby in the first story, and kind of has become full circle to the last story, which I say they use that final story in the movie really only in the sense that Bobby comes back to town. That's pretty much it. They otherwise took it in some different directions that we'll go into. But to start off with, we have the director seems on paper like a pretty decent fit. Scott Hicks, who had done Shine, the Jeffrey Rush movie, and Snow Falling on Cedars, just to name a couple, and some others that aren't even really worth mentioning because they were just so, who cares? Like The Boys Are Back with Clive Owen and stuff like that. Movies that probably nobody remembers. A very great cinematographer who the movie's dedicated to him, and this was his next to last movie, I think. But most notably, he was the cinematographer on Red, from the Three Colors trilogy. So, obviously coming from a great place as far as visual goes, and that's really important to a story like this, because it's basically like capturing what basically feels like memories. And the way those have to be shot in a very specific way, especially if you're going to try to make the book come to life as vividly as it is on the page, which is really, really hard to do, and I'll just say right up front, the movie doesn't get there. But, at least to me. But it is definitely I'd say a worthy enough effort, but the thing is, though, is that the movie came out in 2001, I believe, which means I probably ended up seeing it in, like, maybe the 2003 area. And I wasn't familiar with the book at all. I remember seeing the book in a store once when they redid the cover with the movie's poster, and just thinking, wow, that looks like a really thick book for a movie that doesn't look that interesting to me. I would have been like 12 at this time. And so I did eventually see the movie, and I thought it was one of the dullest damn things I had ever seen. Pretty much exactly what I thought how I would feel about it going into it. But of course, at that time, I had not read the book. And there were a lot of people, not necessarily the critics, but there were audiences that still took to the movie and found it really moving and profound and nostalgic and all that other stuff. And those people, like, talking about people that maybe didn't read the book. But as far as reading the book and how much that changed everything, because when you see the movie from my perspective, where I thought it was really dull, going into the book, I wasn't really that psyched, but it was like, well, it's King, and I have faith in him, so there's got to be maybe something that was lost in the translation. And sure enough, I read the book later in life, and there are bits that I remember from the movie, but those bits did not feel the same at all. Like, everything, like, every individual moment in the book felt so, like, rich and vivid. And when we talk about it seeming like you can almost, because there's that nostalgia thing, that's the coming-of-age thing that King has perfected over the course of his career, it's, like, going back to what we were saying about the body in the last video we did of this, where it was like all those characters and all those moments you could relate to something and like identify it from your own life and say like you know the characters in the body, or you had a similar situation like this, but it's more so taking the fictional instances and relating them to something else that was in your life that just kind of reminds you of that. With Hearts in Atlantis, it's different because it feels like Bobby's memories are suddenly your memories. Like, it's not you relating it to something else that happened in your life. When you're reading Hearts in Atlantis, you feel like, or at least Lemon and Yellow Coats, you are. It feels like everything that happened to you. Like, you can imagine, like, just reading it, it feels like you yourself suddenly have a memory of reading Lord of the Flies when it was still newish, or going to the theater and seeing Village of the Damned and seeing like the air conditioning sign and stuff like that, or falling in love with Carol Gerber when you were 11 years old and the kiss on the Ferris wheel, or putting up with Harry Doolin's bullshit, getting lost in the bad part of town, and of course meeting someone like Ted and getting attached to them. Even if there are no particular instances in your real life that even come close to any of this, King has a way of making these images so vivid that it suddenly feels like you can relate to everything. To where it's like you are remembering these things as your own life almost, which is insane. But he is able to do that. And like I said, even, we've talked about this a number of times, making you nostalgic for an era you weren't even born in, as if you were there. This is what that whole story really does well. And I didn't get that vibe from the movie the first time I saw it, and I still think that when you get to the movie now, after having read the book, it almost, the book feels so intimate and vivid that everything you see in the movie has like a sort of distance, like a sort of distant feel to it. Because it doesn't quite feel exactly like we're as in. And the crazy thing about that also is that it's not told from like the first person, like you would think would be, like it would have to, that would be what would get you in that mindset and get that into your head, and make everything feel so vivid. But no, it's just told like any other story, but there's still like that distance, like I said, when you're not in the context of the text in the book, where and that ends up being its downfall in a lot of places. Like, stuff that really, really hits hard in the book almost feels like it comes too early, and like the movie almost feels too short or too rushed or both. Like the moment when he comes to the conclusion that Ted will eventually have to go away, and he says, will you have to go away? In the movie, it almost feels like it's happening too early, so like it's not earned, and it's like we don't really have enough between them from that point in the movie. I think that movie's only like a half an hour in, when we're supposed to feel like the really big emotional attachment to Ted, and it doesn't feel quite there as it does in the book, because it's, well, I take for instance just little things that, like we were talking about how great the cinematographer is and how very well shot the movie is, but there are some cases where it could have been a lot more involving as far as like visually and the way certain things are. Like, sometimes the way characters in movies are introduced just visually can make a really big difference depending on how it's done. And when we see Ted for the first time in the movie, yeah, we get that sort of tease shot where we see his bags on the ground and we just see him from, like, the knees down. And, his Bobby's mom's making, like, comments on him. And then he just kind of unceremoniously comes down the steps, and he's just there. He's just Anthony Hopkins. He's a character in a movie now. I almost feel like, obviously you don't want to make that too dramatic, because then that's overkill. But I still feel like it's an underwhelming interest for Ted in the sense that when Ted enters the story, we should feel like a shift of sorts. Like, we should feel that this was just an ordinary, everyday world, this neighborhood, this child's life, this mother's life, whatever. And then suddenly, just through him walking into their lives, there is now magic in this world. Like, he brought the magic with him, And it's like you really feel like you should feel some sort of shift in regards to that, but it just doesn't really. It just feels so unceremonious. But with that said, the presence of Anthony Hopkins alone will bring a lot to what might be missing in those initial moments. Like we get the scene where he's telling him about the low man, and he's walking around the apartment and doing all this stuff, and it's all in one shot, most of it. And it's like there's something so almost like demanding of attention in that way, but in a really subtle way. And also the way Hawkins is able to do... Hawkins would be able to do that anyway without it just being in one shot, but the combination of the two make it this really great moment in the movie that really establishes just how important the information being given in this scene is. And obviously we're seeing it through a child's perspective of, is this, just some made-up story or tale or something, or is it real? And then there's the whole thing of, if the low men are real, who are they and where do they come from? Are they like government, or are they something else entirely? Which is interesting because with the way the book and the movie set up their worlds, you can kind of break that off into, you could go into one of each territory, where obviously we get much more of what's going on in the book because we have the whole Dark Tower connection, which obviously the movie's not going to go into, of course. Nor would we really, would we want to ask the movie to go into that, because then it opens up a whole other thing when it's really just kind of supposed to be a standalone movie, which you can argue the whole thing of making this a standalone movie when you got all these other stories in here with the characters in different directions they went, if making a standalone movie was even a good idea in the first place. But if we're going to be in the mindset of a standalone movie, yeah, best not to even touch the Dark Tower stuff, just from that standpoint, because then you open up a whole can of worms that's just going to confuse the audience even more, and so, yeah, there's that. But, and obviously we have our, some more side characters here, like Hope Davis playing Bobby's mom, which I like what Hope Davis was, especially with not a lot of screen time, because obviously when you read the story, Bobby's mom is a very complicated character, because the thing is the thing that makes it so complicated, of course, is that she's obviously coming from a very, sympathetic place. Where obviously Bobby's dad, died, and now she's a single mother, and this wasn't what she was prepared for. And she's basically just bitter at life in general, maybe a bit bitter at him, because the book goes into this a little more. The fact that he pretty much looks exactly like his dad, so he's just like this lingering memory for her. But there are also plenty of, and eventually what happens to her. But apart from that, there are also things throughout the story that make Bobby's mom very, very hard to love, regardless of the sympathetic area we know she's coming from. And so that's a really complicated thing to play, to make Bobby's mom not basically close to a villain in this story, which could have been the case if not handled as delicately as, say, King or the movie and Hope Davis's performance do. So there's enough handling of that works out. But there's also cases of, like, Alan Tudyk, who had an interesting task here as the Monty Man at the carnival. Just doing the card game where he shuffles and you have to find the queen and all that. Or the red card. And it's interesting how much that character leaves an impression in the book with only that one scene. And it's really just to kind of show what exactly Bobby can do now that he's been around Ted and that power that he has. But there was something about that character that just really stood out. And Alan Tudyk was also one of those cases where when I saw the movie the first time, it was, even when the movie didn't make an impression, he made some sort of impression. And then that character made an impression again in the book. And to be able to just have that one scene where he doesn't really have that much to do. The character doesn't even leave the spot he's standing in. Yet both the character in the book and Alan Tudyk's performance can leave that impression. There's really something intriguing about that character. And more so the fact that we never see him outside of this one instance. Even he makes such an impression. You almost keep waiting for him to come back in some way. But thankfully that never happens, because it probably would have been super convoluted, and it's just more impactful that he's able to leave that impression with just that one moment. So there's that. And there's some changes that the movie makes that are interesting, like there's the character of Rihanna in the book, who is like a friend of Carol's family, and she's the one that stops Harry Doolin the first time he's like terrorizing them, and it's this whole big scene, and I do like that where you can almost say it's like another, adult female figure in Bobby's life, because his mom's obviously extremely distant and potentially resentful towards him. So there was something kind of impactful about that and the sort of like attachment he got to Rihanna because of that very important moment in the book. But of course, the movie has a much more condensed story to tell. So I feel like it wasn't a bad call at all to have Ted in the place of that, where he's the one that not only confronts Harry but uses his powers to disarm Harry, I guess you could say. And obviously, of course, regardless, it's going to come back to bite them anyway, now that Harry has been antagonized. And it is interesting also how that sort of changes that direction, where when Carol gets attacked by Harry later on, and then subsequently Bobby has to attack Harry, and in the movie doesn't go into this, but in the book it almost kind of leads him down this path of turning into like a bad kid of sorts, once he attacks Harry brutally, but justifiably and satisfyingly. But the interesting thing that the movie brings up by putting Ted in that place is, regardless of the positive impact that Ted had on him, and it kind of is this driving force of wherever he's going to go and the decisions he's going to make, the fact that Ted pretty much is the starting point of Carol getting attacked by Harry and Bobby's subsequent retaliation, because Ted's the one that confronted him and really got down to his core to humiliate him and get him angry in that sense. So it's interesting that you can bring that back to Ted and see where the series of events went as far as the movie goes. But I like it in the sense of the book as well. But I actually think there's something a bit more interesting going on with what the movie did with putting Ted in that particular circumstance. So, yeah. And there's also some stuff that's kind of missing from the movie that's just really endearing in the book. Like, really just in general, Bobby's love of books. And obviously they go into it, a little bit where he gets the library card and Ted convinces him, and it is still profound regardless, this whole idea that Ted comes from clearly this other world with all these sort of magic surrounding him and what it is exactly he can do, yet he finds so much solace in just the simplicity of books themselves. And it's also really nice to see that from King, because it's like when you see all of his different stories, there's like a consistent, almost bitterness from where he's coming from as like an author standpoint, when it's, whether it be interacting with fans or writer's block or just generally going insane trying to write. It almost gives you this sort of negative connotation between King and how he really feels about books. So seeing characters like this, like Bobby and Ted, and the discussions they have about just the beauty and love of books. And it also kind of gives you vibes of, when Bobby really starts getting into it, he kind of gives you vibes of Ben Hanscom from It, who spent so much of his time at the library and just getting books left and right, and just that love of that. So it's really nice to see that from King, and kind of feels like a bit of a different, more positive vibe, because obviously we know this is a medium that, this is the medium that just is King. And it's like maybe sometimes that can be lost in the, just how much, like I said, an author's mind can almost get resentful towards the medium itself because of the work that goes into it and having to do it, and how crazy it can drive you. But at the end of the day, obviously, there's just massive love for the medium that I always love seeing in his character specifically. Because that's something else that just comes through so, like, sincerely and so vividly. So, Yeah, but like I was saying, though, really at the end of the day, the movie's problem is that it's too short and it's a bit too rushed. So we're missing out on some really great stuff here. Like, and obviously, I'm not one of those people where you have to adapt a book directly for it to work. But the adaptation is pretty much faithful enough to the first story that it's you really get the sense that there's pieces of it missing. And in a story like this that's so intimate, those all of the little tiny individual pieces of the story make all the difference in bringing that whole thing to life, that whole feeling to life that this story is. And yeah, so like the whole sequence of him going down there by himself and getting lost and trying to find Ted and all that. Stuff like that is really missed. And then there's the big difference, like the really big change that the movie made. And I'm still conflicted by it, even though I can see both angles. Obviously, I talked about the very last story in the book, where really the only thing they adapted was Bobby comes back to his hometown. Because there's the whole thing of Carol was potentially in a fire that potentially killed her. So the movie begins with Bobby learning at Sully John's funeral that Carol has also died, which is something he didn't know. And which is this really big gut punch, of course, which David Morse plays very well. But the thing here is that obviously, because the movie is a condensed one story, and we're not even touching the other stories in the book, you would have to go into a whole other thing, talking about all the other stories to explain why Carol is thought dead, but is not actually. So the movie was like, well, we can't go into all that. Like, how are we going to squeeze all of that into exposition in the last 5 minutes? So Carol just has to stay dead, which sucks. because she obviously, like I said, the way the book is able to do an inception thing and like basically put the memories in your head as if they were your own. And so you can imagine that you were Bobby on the Ferris wheel with Carol when you were 11, and you got really attached to that character, and to just have that moment in the book where it turns out that what we thought was true actually wasn't. And there's that really great moment when we kind of come to terms with what exactly we're seeing. Because much like Bobby, we're not really... There's such a vagueness to it and we're not quite sure what exactly is going on. Because when Carol comes back at the end of the book, it kind of has that same feel to it, where like there's always something almost supernatural feeling throughout the story, whether it be what Sully John sees right before he dies in his car, or going back to the first story with pretty much everything with Ted, and the connection to the Dark Tower and all that stuff. There's just something so like magical and otherworldly about this. So when he sees Carol and he's kind of seeing her through the sun, and he can't quite get her face just right, and she's saying the things back to him that he knows Carol said. Like the last thing she ever said to him was, I have to make the salads, a detail that the movie kept. And it turns out that it's her just under another identity because of all the shit that she got involved in. And it's the way it just kind of slowly dawns on you, and then it actually does occur to you that this really is her, she really is alive. And it's this feeling of like, because on top of the magic and the otherworldly, there's also that warmth in the first story, and that warmth seems to come full circle in this moment where they reunite in the place where she was attacked, and he basically saved her. And there's just such a warm closure to everything. Like, it feels like it came full circle. It feels like everything is right when even though, he's married and has children and all that. And she's got her own separate secret life or whatever. Or new life, I guess you could say. Just this moment of the two of them together on the bench in the park is it's just really the perfect note to end on. And just the fact that Carol's still there just leaves you with something, especially when it's teased to us that she might have been dead. So you go into the movie with that feeling. It almost feels like a massive betrayal that in the movie wants us to accept that Carol's dead in their version. Which is hard to do. And they do have the nice detail where she has the daughter that's played by the same actress. And I do think another reason that the movie's ending can work, if you're not too attached to the book's ending, is the whole idea of Bobby coming back, and not just that really, but going all the way back to Ted being taken. Where you have the idea of this guy who's like, the one and only friend, the one and only father figure, and he has this gift, but of course, like life in general, anything special, something in regards to fate or whatever is coming wants to take it away, seemingly. Just anything that makes you content, or anything that makes you happy, or anything that makes you feel like the world makes sense. There is something in life looming that wants to take that away, somehow, is the vibe that I get from a symbolic standpoint. And so the whole thing is kind of dealing with life's harsh realities. So I could see where it plays into dealing with life's harsh realities, to come back and not only be old, not only be at the funeral of one of his old best friends, but on top of hearing that his first love is also gone and is not coming back. But you will still find those certain ways to deal with it, like how he has that little connection with the daughter and he gives her the picture and all that in the movie. So I can see from that standpoint also, where it's like, maybe it's less, idealistic or whatever, and more like living in realism or whatever. But that just depends on how you want to view stories, I guess. Because obviously stories can be both things. Stories can either show you the harsh realities, or stories can kind of be that, escapist idealism or whatever. And both of these adaptations give you one of each. So there is that. But I've got this extreme soft spot for the book now. But yeah, the movie does have a lot more of an impact once you've read the book, even if it's this real unfortunate thing here. Sort of the spear that they talk about, where it's once the book gives you more context, the movie can give you more of a profound feeling or whatever when you're watching it, knowing the story, but at the same time, the book is so detailed and so rich, and so personal, that you can see so many chunks missing that just don't give the movie the impact, and it feels like the movie's missing a lot of stuff. But I mean, they did what they could as far as doing like a standalone story out of a book like this. But yeah, I for the most part just kind of like to stick to the book when it comes to this. But despite some of the other things that we're gonna talk, like when I was talking about Stand By Me and The Body, where it's like I can interchange both of them. When it's when I'm reading The Body, I can think like, oh yeah, this feels like the movie, and when I watch the movie, it's like, oh yeah, I can really sense the story in this. When I watch the movie Hearts in Atlantis, all I do is long for the book. And it's not reciprocated, so... but the movie's fine. It's fine. So, there's that. And like I said, the movie has had a profound impact on certain audiences, and you can definitely see that, but I just feel like once you've gone to the book for this particular story, it's really, really hard to go back to the movie, so... that's how I feel on that. So, now we're going to go in October, which means we're going to get into more horror-related of the King novellas, going into Four Past Midnight and Full Dark No Stars. So, and all that other stuff that's going on in October. So, basically, a shitload. So until all that stuff, I think that's it for this.